Hey everybody, welcome to the Anthony and Todd Show. I'm your host, Vincent.
And I'm Trevor.
I'm Jonathan Reeser.
And welcome to the Album Corral, a segment where we wrangle together a bunch of different albums from over the last couple of weeks that we may have missed, and all three of us are going to highlight them in a series of little, tiny, micro reviews. And without any further ado, I think it's time to get right into the business. I really enjoyed Rina's 2017 EP, and I was hoping we would hear an album from her way sooner than we actually did. Between the EP and this album, she released a bunch of singles that I wasn't super interested in when comparing to the glistening pop music that was on the Rina EP. This new album, it had like an arc for me. It kind of started off of like, I felt like this was just the same as the EP, but then that ended up becoming like a positive instead of a negative because she's just going through so many areas of pop on this. She has the great Clarence Clarity backing her on a decent amount of the tracks on here, and I find throughout the entire thing it's just an ode to the various generations of pop, and she just fits so naturally over it. It's a nice, ambitious, overtaking pop album, and one of the best pop albums of the year, one of my personal favorites, along with Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia.
Alright, this latest Uchis EP was a surprise drop. To Feel Alive is only about 10 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and it's only 4 tracks long. Uchis hasn't really put out any solo material since Isolation back in 2018, which was a really awesome mix of Latin pop, R&B, neo-soul. I thought it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that album, and I was excited to see where she went next. She's been collaborating with a lot of other artists since then. This first track, Honey Baby Spoiled, sounds like a Flower Boy cut. It sounds like it was ripped right off of Tyler, the Creator's Flower Boy. It's got very dreamy keys with Callie floating over top of it. She sounds like she's just in a state of pure bliss. The next track, Angel, I found to be a little boring. I didn't particularly like that one, but the next track, I Want War, But I Need Peace, sounded extremely smoky. Uchis almost sounds like a lounge singer over these flourishing keys. I love the really like lo-fi kind of feel of this track. And then moving into the final track, To Feel Alive, I think this is where Uchis starts to really ramp up her performances. I really like these walking plucked strings in the background, but I actually left this feeling rather unsatisfied. I thought that the ending of this was finally starting to ramp up to something that I was like, wow, we started to see some of this isolation energy that she had been putting into her previous projects. And this EP seems extremely tame. It tells a very short, condensed love story, but the message doesn't particularly get across, especially only 10 minutes long. It's only got 4 tracks. It doesn't progress very well. I don't think that she is anywhere near as experimental or fun as she was on Isolation, which is extremely disappointing. I really liked that album, and I was excited to see where she went next, especially with all these great collaborations that she's been putting herself in, and I can't help but think that this was an extremely unsatisfying project.
Soakie is a new hardcore punk outfit, pretty traditional hardcore sound. They don't go too outside of the norm. They're not pushing the genre in a way that an Otoboke Beaver or a Show Me the Body is. They're not either changing the way the genre is and pushing it to its next natural conclusion, or taking the elements of hardcore and bringing them in such a fast, frantic, high energy way that becomes this dizzying soundscape. But within this pretty traditional, straightforward hardcore album, there is a lot of personality from the lead vocalist, which really cements the enjoyability for this album. Her vocals range from just a kind of off-kilter, yelpy singing to just a screeching, guttural, like angry growl. And the way she can switch between the two so readily and so at a dime is a fantastic. Lyrically and thematically, this album is important though because it's really highlighting the issues that modern punk has, where it's kind of become a boys club, and that's an issue that punk and hardcore has always kind of had, and that whereas the original era of punk and the movements like the anarcho-punk movement, some of these smaller movements were more diverse. Hardcore and the modern resurgence and the modern popularity of punk is pretty heavily, predominantly masculine and male. And even when people try to inject a female personality or female perspective in just genre, that's usually considered to be a new genre unto itself, such as Riot Grrrl. And so this album really highlights the issue with that concept, instead just saying that we just need to create these areas within the existing punk genres. We don't need to make new genres, we just need to get more voices within these genres. And so from that context, this is a really important hardcore album. It's definitely worth listening to if you're a fan of hardcore. Musically though, it's fun, it's exhilarating, it's a great listen, but it's not pushing any of the edges that hardcore has already naturally reached musically. It's not trying to evolve the genre, but it is very well placed within the currently existing structure of the genre.
This latest DaBaby album is pretty much an amalgamation of all of his previous work, but this time it's just more watered down. He's been giving us the same performance since the beginning of last year. He hasn't mixed it up a lot. While there's been amazing hits like Bop under his belt, he hasn't really showcased any versatility to any of his work. I think while sometimes you'll occasionally get a hook or performance on here that's fun and showcases his confidence in a really nice and flattering way, a lot of other times it's the same material being presented in the same way over and over again, to where his own sound gets watered down and means nothing. John Darnielle's return to lo-fi, recording an entire album off of a boombox during the pandemic while quarantining in isolation, is a nice return to lo-fi. It has its roots in previous earlier Mountain Goats material. I find it to be more consistent than his last project. I think overall it highlights his character pretty well. I think it's just a nice little piece that showcases kind of the general mood of what is happening during this pandemic and some of the gloominess, but also some of the hope, and how, especially in the last track where it's like this desperate ode to make it through the year. I find it to just be a nice little album that doesn't break barriers that the Mountain Goats haven't already crossed, but I find it just to be a nice little piece during this pandemic, that one of the better pieces during this pandemic that just has showcases the general mood and the soundscape that this entire area has brought us so far.
The album is a pretty good mix of funky saxophone mixed with post-punk mentality. The album as a whole is a pretty enjoyable experience. It doesn't really hit a lot of the more thoughtful moments that you would get on a Viagra Boys or Tropical Fuckstorm album, but instead focuses more on just being really high, upbeat, funky soundscapes in a traditional post-punk setup. The saxophone is the strongest element on this album, pretty much carrying what would otherwise be a pretty traditional post-punk album past that level, becoming a more noteworthy experience than your typical albums from this genre. It doesn't do much though beyond the saxophone and the enjoyable performance from its lead vocalist to really cement itself as an essential album, but if you are a fan of the post-punk genre, this is definitely an album worth listening to. Treason is the newest album from one of the classic hardcore bands D.O.A. It's also the latest in the long string of old, irrelevant, tired punk bands trying to make a new album based on the politics of Trump and trying to take Trump down a notch, which, while yes, I agree with that concept, unfortunately a lot of the bands who are doing this are just very old and tired and are not bringing anything new to these conversations. This follows up after Bad Religion's Age of Unreason and Anti-Flag's terrible 2020 Vision. Both those albums are excruciatingly bad musically, they're very cringy lyrically for the most part, and they just feel very tired. Unfortunately, this new D.O.A. is no different from that. It's a very tired, by-the-numbers punk hardcore album with all of its edge having long since been lost from the decades of the band playing. It isn't as bad as Bad Religion or Anti-Flag. It still has a little bit of the grit left. D.O.A. isn't washing themselves down like Bad Religion has, or not maintaining this unbearable cringy attitude the way that Anti-Flag is. D.O.A. is still D.O.A. It's just that D.O.A. at this point is very old and it's very clear that they're just kind of reached their limit as a band. While this album isn't the worst of all these old bands trying to make a new album, it is not really worth the listen. The lyrics don't really go deep into anything beyond just Trump is bad, and it doesn't give any nuance to their ideas. There's some tracks on here where they're trying to relive their glory days with tracks like It Was D.O.A, but because it's a band that's so far removed from the way they used to, their edge, their old grit, it doesn't really come across as a good nostalgic track. It just comes across as very sad because this is a band trying to live something that they just don't have anymore, and it's just a very sad experience from a very classic hardcore punk band.
I like their most popular album, Black Up. I think it showcases like the cool and loose character of a Shamia Butler, but on this, Shamia Butler's too cool and loose. It's like wearing a pair of sweatpants, and the instrumentals behind them are so boring and flat that it doesn't mean anything. This thing feels so empty. One thing I can give them, it's better than their last two albums, because there isn't two albums worth of material being put in front of me that is really boring. It's only one, so I'll give them that. But it's just like there's no bite to this. There's no production that backs a Shamio up well on here, and Shamio's so loose and abstract that it really doesn't have any weight to anything he's saying. I went into this not knowing what I was going to expect, because I haven't listened to any Fiona Apple's discography, but I was interested to see what the outcome of my opinion of this would be, because this album was hyped up to death. Pitchfork gave it a 10. There's a whole entire like meme with Fantano giving it a 7. But overall, what I have to say about this album is that it's good. It's really interesting. There's some nice drum work on here. There's some lovely keys. It has this kind of like rough around the edge nature at times, but not all tracks are created equal in the sense that it feels a little bit too loose in structure, to where Fiona doesn't really seem as potent at times. For the most part, I think this is good singer-songwriter material. There's some amazing tracks on here for her, Fetch the Bolt Cutters, Shamiqua, I Want You to Love Me. I think there's some like verbose styles of production that kind of comes off of a like really loose, that really highlights her really well. And again, as I mentioned before, it's just like sometimes that's too loose. Sometimes we have lost all definite shape, and it kind of just feels like wandering, which sometimes could be a good thing. But Fiona Apple, I feel like sometimes she just needs to have a little bit more structure than what she's giving us on this project.
Moor Jewelry is the collaborative project of Moor, Mother, and Mental Jewelry. True Opera is an interesting experience because its first handful of tracks are very interesting takes on a mixture of hardcore punk, post-punk, experimental punk, and it's a fun, interesting experiment at first, but then as the album goes on, that experiment doesn't feel interesting anymore. It starts feeling very tired and repetitive. They don't bring enough change to this initially unique experience, and so the uniqueness unfortunately doesn't last long, and it's a very one-note project. And while that note at first is cool, this album shouldn't be an album. It should be an EP, because an EP length is pretty much all the ideas that they had. After that, it becomes a repetitive slog to listen to, even though it's not even like barely over half an hour long.
This was an excellent surprise. I know nothing about Moses Boyd. I went into this because I heard this album was good, and I checked it out, and it is good. It's an excellent mix of jazz and electronica, kind of blending it together in very unexpected ways, sometimes focusing heavily on jazz, sometimes focusing heavily on electronica. You get moments where you get these unstoppable, chaotic, Sons of Kemet-like jazz chemistry where everything just feels stacked on top of each other so perfectly. You get this very cool and collected electronica that's very chilling and brooding at the same time. It feels very perfect with a mix of very eclectic drums and flourishing keys and some amazing horns stacked on top of that. There's also an excellent open JR feature on this. I think you should definitely check this out.
Little Dragon has been around for a long time, and I really got to know them through their work with artists like Damon Albarn with Gorillaz, especially on Empire Ants on Plastic Beach, which I thought was an awesome track. You had their work with K Tornado, their work with Flying Lotus on Flamagra, but Little Dragon as a whole, like, solo act hasn't really captured my attention much. This album, though, I think really solidifies why so many artists want Little Dragon as a collaborator. For example, their opening track on here, Hold On, is super disco-inspired. It's really poppy with some great synth work. I love their vocalist's rhythm and cadence to her voice. I think it's just awesome. It's very rare that singers can do that, but I think that she is extremely talented. Little Dragon really shows off a lot of their synth work on the front half of this album, and I really enjoy that iconic sound from them. But I really like how on the back half as well, we start to go from some synth pop, more like disco inspired tracks, to more soul inspired tracks. I think Water is an excellent bouncy ending. It feels like a very leisurely walk down the street. Tracks like Are You Feeling Sad, I think, starts out with this really weird flute intro with the vocal sample, Are You Feeling Sad? Well, I've got the song for you. Goes into an excellent soul inspired track. I think Little Dragon really proves themselves on this album, and I've heard a lot of other people talking about how this was their defining work, about like how this album specifically really solidified their sound as not only a collaborator to so many great artists, but as well as a good solo act, and I think that I would agree with that. This is a pretty solid project.
Danzig's newest covers album, Scenes ELVIS, is an album that makes sense but doesn't work at all. Glenn Danzig is the original lead vocalist for the classic punk band The Misfits before they separated and he created his own solo project just simply titled Danzig. Danzig's vocals are very heavily based on the tradition of rockabilly established by Elvis Presley. There's numerous tracks from his old catalog where an Elvis Presley comparison isn't out of the question. It actually makes a lot of sense. His vocals fit that realm. So the idea of him making an Elvis covers album isn't an outlandish idea. It makes sense. Unfortunately, this is a novelty album that has zero novelty. Whereas I would expect Danzig, a former punk then turned metal artist, to take these Elvis covers and make something interesting and new of them. He does a very straightforward by the numbers covers. They're very reminiscent of how the old songs were to a T. There's nothing unique to it. There's nothing novel to this album. It's very boring. His vocals sound sometimes forced, which they never used to have to be forced to sound like Elvis. It was just natural to him, and now he seems like he's trying too hard, whereas it already came naturally to him. The one thing I will give this album, though, is it does showcase his love of Elvis. These are very deep-cut tracks that he's choosing to cover. He's not going the basic expected route doing tracks like Jailhouse Rock or Hound Dog. He's actually finding these very lesser known tracks to cover and bring to life, and that is unique. Unfortunately, he vocally and musically doesn't do anything to make him finding these tracks worthwhile.
I found this to be very underwhelming. There's some nice moments of psychedelia on here. In the end, I feel it's kind of the same to the last Tame Impala album, where it's just like, I feel like this is just very underwhelming in the sense that there's no real a depth to the style performance we're giving. It just feels very bland top 40 rock-ish. It seems too clean, doesn't seem like it mixes up enough or blends enough with everything around it, or there's no ongoing environment being presented. It just seems like we're getting track after track after track of these big ballads that really don't mean anything. The best track's obviously the first one with the huge horns, the funky guitar and bass behind. It blends so many styles together so perfectly on that opening track, but the rest of the album fails to follow through. It's not really a terrible album by any means. I just find it pretty mid-tier to a lot of psychedelic rock. So that's it for this review. If you want to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you can find us at Anthony and Todd. If you want to find us on Patreon, patreon.com/The Anthony and Todd Show, and you find us at Podbean, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Play Podcasts, and Spotify by searching Anthony and Todd Show in your favorite podcast browser. Until next time, guys, I've been Vincent.
And I'm Trevor.
I'm Jonathan Reeser.
And see ya, boyos.